Welcome to Matrescence Unfiltered, the podcast exploring what really happens to your identity, ambition, and career when you become a mother. Matrescence is the transition into motherhood, and it's one of the biggest identity shifts a woman will ever go through. Yet, when it comes to our careers, it's still barely understood. So often, motherhood gets framed as something to push through and bounce back from.
We think it's something else entirely, a capability shift, and we think it's time to name it and to talk about it properly. I'm Rose, coach, consultant, and researcher completing a master's in organisational psychology.
And I'm Bianca, a chief marketing officer, pregnant, and living this experience in real time. Each episode, we take one belief about motherhood and work that doesn't hold up under scrutiny and break it down properly.
Using research, lived experience, and honest conversations about what sustainable high performance actually looks like when your identity is shifting.
Welcome to Matrescence Unfiltered. We're really glad you're here.
A quick note before we start today's episode. This one got big, really big. So we've decided to split it into two parts, and this is part one. Here, we get into the real cost of becoming a mother, the earnings you lose, the career that shifts underneath you, the gap that quietly grows for years. We put actual numbers to the things nobody warned you about. This part is the why. Part two is where we get practical. So if you finish this a bit fired up with nowhere to put it, that's on purpose. We hand you the tools next time. For now, let's get into it.
Today, we're going to put numbers on things that often go unspoken because the data is stark, surprise, surprise, and women deserve to know it. I'm excited for this episode, Rose.
I'm so excited for this episode. I think since we began our podcast plan, what we want to share, this one has been like top priority. So yeah, let's get into it.
Same for me. So, where do we want to begin? I think that the big question to sort of set the scene is around what motherhood actually costs us. And I think a big point for this entire episode is you have the literal financial cost, but you have the emotional cost, the labor cost. There's a broader kind of economic theory that we want to get into. But yeah, where do you want to start? Big topic. My favorite topic, by the way. I love talking about money.
I think to come at it from two angles, so the macro picture and then a deeply personal one. And as always, we are going to flip the usual narrative. The conversation is usually about what women give up, and we want to talk about what the economy loses when women step back. I think that, for me, is the most important thing. So I think before we get into the big numbers, let's just acknowledge the daily stuff first. The maternity clothes you buy and rotate through in 6 months. The baby clothes that last about 6 weeks and then they grow out of them. Then there is an entire microeconomy of motherhood that nobody really prepares you for. Prams, monitors, cots, the gears, comparison to what other people have as well. Most of it seems non-negotiable and most of it is temporary, which I think makes it feel particularly brutal.
Yes, I am thinking of this chapter of my life as the most expansive time of my life and the most expensive. I really am. So I relate to all of this. What do we know data-wise about the cost of raising a child? What UK data do we have on this?
So the estimated cost of raising a child up until the age of 18 for a couple is £165,872. And it's actually
Oof.
more if you're a lone parent. So if you're a single parent, it's £186,822. So the gap there is already a story, I think. And that number spreads across the 18 years. But the most concentrated spend is in the early years. Childcare alone is where most of it lands. So the reality of childcare, and I know that you'll be starting to look through some of this as you're thinking about nursery. So the average cost of full-time nursery place for a child in England in 2026 is £149 a week. That actually goes up to £239 a week without funded hours, which for many is a reality before eligibility kicks in. So for context, funded hours you only get if your combined household earnings are under £100,000 per year, which might sound like a lot of money, but actually, in reality, especially if you're living in London, that is a very average wage. And that that additional cost is so expensive, and actually nursery in London is much more expensive as well, or in cities. So it's £8,000 to £18,000 annual nursery costs, depending on the location and the hours. In some cities, like London, it's closer to that £18,000 a year. What you've also got to consider as well is backup childcare. So when your child is too sick for nursery, which, coming out of my research, is the most common struggle when it comes to performance, is dealing with sick children. So when they're not well enough to go to nursery, you need to think about who is available to look after them. Or are you going to take annual leave, unpaid leave, if there's nobody else? Again, we've spoken about how to build your village before, but if you've got nobody around you, then that is, a lot of money. Pregnant and Screwed have done some really good research around this. And yeah, the amount of women that take personal leave or take unpaid days to cover for childcare is high.
There's so much that going into this I've been really surprised by. Now, I know that there are some great businesses out there that are trying to help ease the upfront costs of having a child. For example, the rental of certain baby equipment, prams, all the things you have to get. But do you remember when I put together my baby shower list? I felt
Mm.
awkward even sending that because the average cost of an item on there was probably between like 50 to £80. We're looking at changing mats, bouncers, high chairs. It's a whole world. And bottle sterilizers. There's so much to factor in. And we know that in the UK, the majority of people are living paycheck to paycheck. There's not this sudden buffer or increase you're going to get. If anything, as a woman looking into this, you are trying to tighten the purse strings because you know that you only have a limited amount of maternity pay. And if it's your first baby, like it is mine, you don't really know how you're going to feel. You have to also make, to your point about nursery costs and babies being sick a lot. I hear that all the time too on the forums that I'm a part of and other mums that I'm speaking with. You have to make an equation. There's a really distinct equation here of, okay, how much do I earn versus how much is childcare going to cost? What's the balance? That's the financial cost. What's the longer term impact on my earnings if I go part time, if I step aside for a bit? And how does it all add up? When I know that after, in my case, 5 months, which is a good maternity package by lots of standards, I'll be on statutory maternity pay, which has just been increased, but it's still to only 190 a week.
It's gone up by £7 a week.
£7 a week, and that was a big press announcement, as if that was
Yeah.
doing us such a favour.
And I think the problem with that, and I shared this on social media, the problem is that leave has never been the problem. It's supporting women coming back. It's the financial support on the other side of maternity leave that is more important than the additional £7 a week. And yes, it's helpful and it's moving in the right direction, but the leave was never the problem. It's coming back that's more of a problem, in my opinion.
So I think that when we look at the problems here, a big part of it is how women's work is being undervalued, but there's also some historical context that I want to get into because it feels so much harder than it did in many ways for previous generations of mothers, and it's not in our heads. So, in this conversation, I think that a lot of financial podcast episodes, interviews, reflections skip the history. They'll give you the numbers, but they won't tell you like how the equation broke. Over the last several decades, scientific knowledge about child development has expanded dramatically. We've
Mm.
learned more about what keeps babies safe, what promotes brain development, what supports their emotional well-being. And that knowledge, which is so amazing and beautiful and meaningful to have, has become impossible to unknow and ignore. My head is filled with it. There's not a day that goes by where I'm not learning one more tip of something I can do or another study that's come out. It's almost like a Pandora's box. There's an actual problem. And I think that when we look at the cumulative effect of decades of new recommendations, back sleeping, breastfeeding, skin to skin contact, limited screen time, enriched language environments, all the emotional co regulation, that baseline expectation of what is considered like adequate parenting has irrevocably shifted, but none of this has been offset financially. So
No,
that's the big, big problem, like the historical context that I want to get into, because men's time on housework has not changed since the 1970s. But women are now expected to be equals to men in the office and equals to this like intensive, idealized mother model and work, and in many cases, contribute half financially. So this does not balance. And the worst part, final point on this, women blame themselves for not being able to keep up when the reality is we don't have the same hours in the day as previous working mothers and generations before. And we haven't had the financial and economic uplift to support all of this. So, on a basic equation level, the maths is not mathing in
no,
any way.
no. And I think what's really interesting there is, I believe that for our generation of parents, like they did the best with the information they have. We have so much more information now. I know if I was to speak to my mum now around, raising a child mindfully and being an intentional parent and thinking about childhood development, her response would be something will be like, "Oh, you're all right, aren't you?" And there's way more information now, which is much more of a cognitive load to bear. And the time to look into that and investigate into that is not the same as it was in our parents' generation or before. And I think that when you have this information, I can see why there's that blame piece there, because it is a huge amount of pressure to put on yourself.
It is. And you just have me thinking there about what we're going to know in another 20 and 30 years' time that we
Mm,
don't have research on now. And it all goes in phases. But that means that we have to actually economically keep up for mothers too. And
yeah.
going back to the data points that you shared on childcare, I just want to make a point here, which is that economists classify childcare as a luxury good. So, not luxury as in like, um, designer goods or that kind of thing. Luxury as in something that isn't feasible when money is very tight and people make space for as their financial options expand. But that classification, it means that caring for your own children has had an economic value always, but our society has never paid it. So
Mm,
I have been reading this fantastic book that I recommend called, let me get this right, Feminomics by Corinne Lowe. And her argument, what she advocates for, is this idea of like provider neutral childcare subsidies. So, this is the concept that the subsidy that the government do give that you mentioned, as tight as it is, and that is a whole other topic because agreed, that subsidy should be identical whether the mother is providing the care or whether she's purchasing it on the market. So, this current system, which only subsidizes purchase childcare, it implicitly treats a mother's own time as worthless. That's messed up. Provider neutral subsidies would correct that. So it's a little bit freeing to see that the time that you're spending with your children as something that you're making a conscious choice to purchase instead of something you're trapped in. But it doesn't solve the problem of how, on a societal level, we view that time. And I think that's quite an interesting idea of subsidization, and one of the ways that, on a big macro policy level, we could do better for mothers and fathers, as
mm.
we need to bring them into the childcare conversation way more too.
This is where equity versus equality is really important part of the conversation. And it is the perception piece. And I know we've mentioned in a previous episode around the daddy bonus and how much, I think it's been 8 and 14% uplift in mothers' wages after they have a child. The average earnings lost by women in the first 5 years after their first child is £65,618, 42% drop in monthly earnings 5 years on compared to the year before birth, and cumulative loss for mothers of 3 children not over a lifetime, but within 5 years of the third birth, is £124,000. And that's just at an individual level. When we look at this at a macro level as well, it's nearly £100 billion lost in annual economic output due to women's reduced labour market engagement after motherhood. So when we talk about the cost of women not working or working less, we are not talking about a personal lifestyle choice. We are talking about structural economic drain, and yet the framing is almost always placed, as you said, as a luxury item, as a choice placed on the woman. So her ambitions, her choices, her career trajectory. And I think the capability doesn't disappear, it's the conditions that support it. And this is where I think the concept of, well, you can have it all, but you can't have it all at once, becomes really interesting, because I think if the circumstances were right, you could have it all. But it's the conditions around it that have such a huge impact. So yeah, I think that's really important to note as well.
On an emotional level, the women that you speak to in your research, how are they viewing this? How much does financial pressure come up for them? And in what ways, thematically, have you seen the trends or patterns between them?
I mean, finance has come up in every single research conversation I've had, whether that has been a conversation around how much nursery and after school clubs and all of the additional caregiving or childcare expenses are, but also thinking about that longer term piece as well. In the moment when women go off on maternity leave and come back, or make that decision to go part time or do compressed hours, or however that might be shaped, often it's not until 5, 6, 7, 10 years down the line they start thinking about that longer financial shadow, I guess is a good way of putting it. So the impact of your pension, the impact of not investing, and just that whole wider gender pay gap. And I think the motherhood penalty, the problem I have with it, we talk about it, but it's not like getting a speeding ticket and getting a speeding penalty and it's £60, you've got to pay it. This is not a one-off hit. This is a long-term issue, and it compounds over multiple gaps that are all connected. So the gender pay gap is the data most people know about, most people talk about. We've spoken about the gender pension gap before and the gender investment gap. And that truly is where the long-term damage really lands. And often when I speak to women in my research, it's that they never even thought about it. They're so in the moment dealing with nurseries and all of the childhood expense in the immediate term, and don't necessarily have time to reflect on the longer term until much later on. And then often they feel that they would have benefited greatly from having that information at the time when they were making those career decisions. Because as I said, it's not immediate, it's that wider financial shadow.
I think that the language here is so important because Corinne Lowe in her book, she talks a lot about the penalty, and that's the rhetoric that we know. And it is a penalty in so many ways. But her argument is that when a couple say they spend less on restaurants and holidays after having children, economists, and this is really coming at it from the angle of economic theory, but that plays out in every headline we ever read, right? They don't call that a spending penalty. They think of it as like a change in priorities. But when a woman reallocates her time away from paid work and towards her children, the same logic applies, like the financial hit is real, and the numbers that you've shared make that really clear. But her argument and her reframe is that calling it a penalty almost strips her of her agency. So her
Mm.
reframe is that child penalties are actually really child investments. And if we look at the history of work in general, biologically, and the drivers for working and accumulation of wealth have been to procreate.
To
So
provide.
to provide. Provider, exactly. So it's not that it makes the structural problem disappear just by having a language change, but I do think it matters how we name things.
Mm.
And this point really resonated with me because the current naming places the burden of failure on the woman when the data actually tells us a different story. So I think another piece of texture worth adding here is that child penalties are measurably larger for more privileged women. and smaller or more absent for less privileged women, not because they're less affected by motherhood, but because they have the least financial cushion to step back at all. Their options are even more limited. So there is a privilege point that we have to make. I think that the penalty is partly a measure of who had the option to choose, and not all women are negotiating from the same position. So I just wanted to
Mm,
make that clear as a disclaimer for us. Nearly £100 billion lost in annual economic output due to women's reduced labour market engagement after motherhood. That's mind-blowing.
yeah.
So when we talk about the cost of women not working or working less, we're not talking about a personal lifestyle choice. We're talking about a structural economic drain. And yet this framing is always placed on the woman, her ambition, her choices, her career trajectory. And linking this back to matrescence, her capability is not disappearing. It's the conditions that do not support it.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I think women already earn less. They take the career
Yes.
break, they reduce the hours, and each of those things directly reduces pension contributions, immediate earnings, investments over time. And that is the exact point in life where compound growth could be doing the most work. I just think it's wild that we don't talk about it enough. And we don't, I think, at societal level, make the effort to educate women on finances. And I know we've spoken before about Female Invest, which is a fantastic organization that are helping women with their financial literacy. And I highly recommend reading the book. I honestly have learned so much from their work. And a key thing to note here is it's not just about reducing hours and going part-time. And I think there is that daily struggle of balance when it comes to career and motherhood. What we don't necessarily talk about or haven't really spoken about on this podcast is because we do talk about being a mother and having a career. But one thing we haven't really spoken about is the unpaid labor picture.
This is everything to this conversation. Everything. I'm so glad that you're getting into this.
Here is the number, I think, that reframes this whole conversation. So if you were to pay market rates for everything a mother does, childcare, cooking, household management, logistics, emotional labor, the estimated range of that is around, and this is research done in the US, so it's $140,000 per year. And in Australia, research calculated the value of women's typical unpaid labour at around $771 per week. So that's like £400 a week. That is work being done. That is not appearing in any economic measure. So globally, women contribute 76% of all unpaid care work. That's not a footnote. That is the foundation of what the whole economy runs on. Like, you've probably seen those memes, like, imagine how much she could do if she had a wife at home. And I think it's just a really interesting thing to highlight, is that even if you choose not to work, or you can't afford to work because childcare is too expensive, actually the cost of running a household would be so much if you actually paid market rate for it.
And to my point about subsidization of that labor, we're just not connecting
Mm.
that at all. We take it completely for granted. It has a market value. What will it take for us to actually start considering it as such, paying for it, and valuing it? We're raising future generations here while expecting women to take a massive financial hit, like on a personal level. I'm looking at my maternity pay and I'm looking at how long I have my enhanced maternity pay for, when it goes down to the 50%, and then when I will be on the statutory maternity pay. And I'm looking at all of it and I'm weighing up how much nursery would cost for me to go back part time versus what I'd make after tax and all these things. And my mindset, having grown up in this girl boss era and we split everything and I'm a feminist, was that my partner, who is unaffected by any of this, but gets the benefits of obviously being the father of our
Mm.
baby, would just continue paying 50-50, even though I wouldn't have the earnings coming in. And we had this really frank conversation. He said, that doesn't add up. Doesn't make any sense. How is that like your mindset that you would take money from savings to fund that? But that is how deep the conditioning has been for me because I've always been self sufficient. One of the biggest drivers, we spoke about it in previous episodes for me, with my career was to feel financially safe and secure. So I have saved. And in this time, I've been spending a lot less. Part of that is because I'm tired. I can't socialize as much. I can't travel. All the things where I was spending my money before, I'm not doing as much of. But the other very real part is that it feels like preparing for the complete unknown. So you're looking at, well, where can I rein in costs? But the idea that my mindset would be that I would be the childcare provider while still paying 50-50 of our bills from my savings just shows you like how messed up the mindset is. And I had to share that because it's a nonsensical conversation, but it's an actual real discussion that we had. And he really had to pull me up on it. And he was like, this doesn't add up.
Mm.
But that is how deep the conditioning and like the internalized failings almost of if you're not all sorted on this can go. And of course, there's another piece around like accepting help and not being financially independent and what that does on an identity level for me. But again, really strange. Like, if I heard my friend saying that as you're hearing me say that now, I'd be like, are you okay? Like, what's going on? But that is where society's got us to.
I think it's also very personal how people have their own financial setups. But I
Yes.
know a lot of people who have had kind of the raw end of the 50-50 deal. That's not how I operate in my house. We tend to operate on a ratio of income of whoever earns more at what time, because it's been both in our house. I just think that's really interesting because if 50-50 concept was correct, you should technically be saying out of that $140,000, like, I'm charging you 50% of that.
Here's your bill at the end of the month.
I have seen friends who've kind of got the raw deal of that 50-50. This is non-childcare as well, because 50-50 paying for everything, bills, groceries, but also like the labor wasn't 50-50. Like often they were doing most of the housework, most of the cooking. And if you bring that figure of $140,000 into it, or what would that be? Probably around £120,000. If you were to really do 50, you should be charging that as the person doing the work. So I think that's a really interesting dynamic. As I said, that's not how it works for me personally, but I've seen other couples work like that, and often the woman gets the raw end of the deal there.
Oh, there are so many different arrangements and different ways of working this out. I think one of the most useful ideas in feminomics is actually really deceptively simple. And it's this call to action for women to look at the deals in your life in the way that you'd look at any other transaction. Who benefits? Who pays? Who's getting a fair return? So the argument is that most women have actually never been encouraged to audit their own arrangements in their relationships, as you say, at work, at home, with any kind of financial or economic clarity. So we absorb all these costs that we don't name, we provide value that we don't price, and we accept terms we've never actually agreed to consciously. To the point of your friend, you fall into these dynamics, and then before you know it, you're years into a relationship and you're thinking, this isn't serving me anymore.
Mm,
So, the division of domestic labor in a relationship, who is actually carrying what and what is that worth? The return to work deal, what are you giving? What are you getting back? And is that exchange fair? Are you getting a fair deal with that? The childcare calculation, are you making an active choice about how to spend your most precious resource, time? Or are you just responding to whatever the system hands you? And the point isn't to turn every human moment into a spreadsheet. I've been in relationships where they're very spreadsheet focused, and my partner is like, right, these are the bills at the end of the month, that 50-50 thing, right? But it's that when you start seeing all of these deals in your life as transactions with real costs and real returns on both sides, you stop internalizing the imbalance as a personal failure and you
mm,
start seeing it for what it is, which is a structural problem with a negotiable solution. So you can't make good decisions about your life if you don't know what you're actually agreeing to. So when you are in pregnancy, now is the time, and it's never too late, but now is the time in pregnancy, early motherhood, ideally, where you can start looking at the deals you're getting as you would negotiating a job contract, as you would negotiating how many days you work from home, the hours that you do, the commute you take, and looking and auditing your whole life and seeing, where is this not working for me? And this isn't to say that, okay, every woman's going to suddenly have a partner who steps up, but on every single deal that we get, every arrangement, every agreement we have, we've got to start negotiating more. And I love this as a central thesis to the book because I've
Yeah.
never thought about that time and value exchange from those different angles. I've always just thought about, this is my salary, this is how much I need to invest in my pension, this is how much I need to invest in my stocks and shares ISA. The end. It applies to everything.
Yeah, and I read Invisible Women a few years ago. I don't know if you've read that. It's a brilliant book, and it's an infuriating book because I don't think anyone will read it and not feel annoyed at the end. But it talks about the concept of unpaid women's work. And as you say, like, your most valuable resource is time. And the amount of time you spend loading, unloading the dishwasher, putting the washing on, like, that is time. And I think that concept of that unpaid women's work, also connected to what you're talking about in the Feminomics book, is really interesting.
And let's talk about time. Our job contracts are just an exchange of our time for money.
Mm.
So why don't we view our time outside of that employment contract as also an exchange of sorts? I feel like we've applied a male way of working and thinking and accumulating wealth to ourselves. And then, and this is the key point for me of this entire episode and conversation, we internalize the failings.
Mm.
And I don't want that for us. I don't want us to keep thinking that when we hear about the investment gap, the pension gap, we don't know enough about investing, that it's our fault that we have failed to learn about certain things that, on a societal level, we've been intentionally shut out of because, and there's so many reasons for that. There's a whole other episode in there around why is it beneficial for men to have women not being financially independent? Oh, because the whole model of marriage that serves men more than women breaks down. When women are financially abundant and they are set up, we don't need to be with men in the same ways. We have more choices, autonomy. There's so much in that. But
Yeah.
yeah, going back to the personal failing point, when I hear the language around the gap, the penalty, the tax, I personally, on an emotional level, feel like it is a failing of mine and that I'm in this alone. I need to be thinking about my savings, and it's isolating actually in many ways.
It's always been a male dominated field, hasn't it? If we're talking about investments. And this is where I think work from organizations like Female Invest are incredible. So there's some data behind it. So 36% of women invest versus 63% of men. That gap has enormous compound implications over time, as you can imagine. And the irony is that when women do invest, they outperform men by around 0.4% annually on average.
Which
And
is a
so
lot over time, by
it
the
is
way.
a lot over time. And
That's a lot over time.
Female Invest's whole thesis is that investing is how your money starts working for you so that you do not always have to. And it's starting to think about creating wealth outside of your salary. And it's never, ever too late to start. And that framing is particularly pointed when you're a mother and your time and earning capacity are under pressure. Women's top financial priority is to support their family. Men's is retirement savings. So there's two different financial priorities there. And that difference in priority is not a character flaw. It is the response to structural reality. And that is the long-term cost of it.
On the investment point, I always say to friends, because it is really intimidating when you get started
It's
and
so
the language
intimidating.
is so masculine and the entire world is just, it feels impenetrable. when you
Even the
start
user
out.
experience on the apps. So obviously there's apps now that make it easier. They are
Yeah,
so masculine and
they
often
are.
have really complex language. And I'm not a stupid person. Like
Not
I
at all.
understand things, but yeah, it's intimidating. This is where we're going to pause. That was part one. The cost, the penalty that is not really a penalty, and why so much of this still lands on women alone. If you listen to this feeling both a bit outraged and a bit clearer, good. Same. Part two is the useful bit, the accounts, the pensions, the small first steps, and how to start investing when the whole thing feels so intimidating. We also get into a brilliant new book that reframes the lot. So come back for part two. That is where it gets practical. Thank you all for joining us today.
If you've taken something from this episode, we'd be so grateful if you shared it with a friend.
We'd also love to hear from you. Find us on Instagram, TikTok, and LinkedIn. And please share your questions, comments, and experiences. This is a conversation we want to build together.
Until next time.